You ain't nothing but a hound dog.
We learned this week of the durability of the dachshund. Yes, we learned that far from being a somewhat hapless, stumpy-legged breed best suited to transport inexpensive handbag, the lengthy but low-rise creature is in fact a hardy predator which could offer lessons in wilderness survival to the most rugged of special forces operatives, as long as they spoke dachshund. We learned of this from Valerie, a miniature dachshund recovered alive and apparently healthy on Kangaroo Island in, can you guess, Australia, fully 529 days after decamping from a campsite, and we learned from the Agog coverage of a further dramatic devaluation of the word icon.
The miniature dachshund went missing on Kangaroo Island nearly 2 years ago, but luckily for Kangala Wildlife Rescue, the now international icon was found last night.
We learned from the best guesses of bemused boffins that Valerie had survived on roadkill and rainwater, by coincidence the state dish of Florida. Because sticking with the subject of bewildered creatures somehow surviving interminably in situations for which they appear spectacularly ill-suited, we learned that US President Donald Trump is actually not the divisive, polarizing demagogue as which he is routinely portrayed, but instead a great unifier around whom a vast and diverse country, whatever else its citizens may disagree upon, can rally as one proud nation.
I can't wait to see where this goes.
Okay. Tell me more.
Let's see where this goes.
In Canada. We learned that, yes, Canadians had wearied sufficiently of this sort of chat.
Canada should honestly become our 51st state. We wouldn't have a northern border problem. We wouldn't have a tariff problem.
That they were prepared to haul Canada's Liberal Party out of the deep and gloomy pit in which it appeared buried in opinion polls as recently as January and put them back in charge. And we learned that Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, while broadly at characteristically Canadian pains to keep it courteous, was not above a spot of passive-aggressive gloating.
President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never, ever happen.
We learned further of the hazards of exporting Trumpism beyond the borders of the United States from the steeply declining fortunes of Canada's Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre, who just a few months back was in such a commanding position in the polls that it would have seemed that he could only fail to become Prime Minister if he proposed the abolition of ice hockey, punched a moose, or appeared in an advertisement for maple syrup manufactured in Vermont. We learned that Pierre Poilievre had lost not merely the election but his seat, and is therefore reduced, perhaps, to seeking a living as well-loved sideshow attraction, man with the world's Frenchest name. We learned, however, that President Trump himself appeared undaunted.
Oh no.
Well, yes. We learned of Trump's continuing determination to gain the upper hand in his lifelong arm wrestle with verifiable reality, in this instance of his insistence that a clearly photoshopped image of the tattoos of erroneously deported Salvadoran Kilmar Abrego Garcia, which the president recently brandished on social media, was not, in fact, clearly photoshopped, although, to be clear, it very clearly was.
It says MS-13.
That was Photoshopped. So let me
That was Photoshop. Terry, you can't do that. Hey, they're giving you the big break of a lifetime. You know, you're doing the interview. I picked you because, frankly, I never heard of you, but that's okay. But I picked you, Terry. But you're not being very nice.
We learned, however, from further exchanges with American media that the president may not, despite previous musings, be locked into seeking an unconstitutional third term in 2028, and has been giving some thought to how else he might be of service beyond the White House.
I'd like to be Pope. That would be my number one choice.
Though the prospect of someone like Donald Trump inhabiting the role of Pope is obviously preposterous, given that occupants of the throne of St. Peter famously have to exhibit a high tolerance for gold furniture, gaudily painted ceilings, cod Baroque ornamental accoutrements, impenetrable financial arrangements, enormous and barely accountable power, and the adoration of crowds of devoted supplicants. And does any of that sound like anything that would interest Donald Trump? And in what seems a further crucial divergence in outlook between the president and any given pontiff, we learned that Trump appears at best indifferent to the prospect of his tariffs on penguins and, probably more importantly, if we're honest, China, somewhat reducing Yuletide merriment.
They made $1 trillion with Biden, $1 trillion, even $1.1 trillion with Biden selling us stuff. Much of it we don't need. You know, somebody said, oh, the shelves are going to be open. Well, maybe the children will have $2 instead of $30, you know? And maybe the $2 will cost a couple of bucks more than they would normally.
But we learned that possessing fewer dolls may shortly be the least of the difficulties presented to America's children, as we learned of the latest steps in the crusade against fluoride of U.S. Secretary of State for Health and whale-beheading bear corpse dumper Robert F. Kennedy Jr., from whom we learned that while future generations of Americans may be smarter, many of those extra IQ points may have to be expended developing alternative means of chewing their food.
In a meta-review of all the science on fluoride and found that there's a direct inverse correlation between fluoride exposure and low IQ in children. So the more you get, the stupider you are.
Say whatever else you will about the president who put RFK2 in charge of a nation's physical well-being, he does have terrific teeth. For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Muller.